Spider-Man No Way Home released December 17th, 2021, a co-production of Sony Pictures and Marvel Studios, of course co-produced by Kevin Feige and Amy Pascal, and starring Tom Holland as Spider-Man, Benedict Cumberbatch as Doctor Strange, and a whole slew of other characters that we're going to get to. But where to start with this movie? And I know it's been talked about on numerous podcasts ad nauseum, but this was the movie that I couldn't wait to see all year in 2021. I'm a Spider-Man fan by nature. I've been a fan since I was a kid. I can remember reading some of the comic books in my uncle's collection and watching the animated series on Fox. And I think the appeal of Spider-Man has been that really anybody can be under the mask. It could be someone who's white, can be someone who's black, can be any nationality, race, or creed. And his character is so relatable to me, more so than any other hero. And I think that's been the long-lasting appeal of Spider-Man, that he has the same struggles that you or I might have, that he's trying to take care of his aunt, or he's having to go to school, he's having to pay bills, all while fighting crime and doing the right thing. So I was really excited when Spider-Man was brought to the big screen, and we'll get to that a little bit later on. But I've enjoyed seeing the evolutions of the different actors that have played the character and the iterations that the character has gone through. So I was not skeptical, but I thought it was very strange when they decided to reboot the character again. But it was made up for that when we found out that Spider-Man was going to be a part of the MCU. And that was something that I think we all wanted from day one when Marvel Studios announced that they were going to do this whole shared universe. That, well, they don't have the rights to Spider-Man, X-Men, Fantastic Four, but wouldn't it be cool if they did? What would happen with these characters interacting with Iron Man, Thor, Doctor Strange, all these other characters that we've grown to love through what I think has been one of the genius plans, and something that we're going to be talking about for generations, laying out the foundation for the Marvel Cinematic Universe. I don't think any of us expected that it would be as big as it became, and still is. But when they added Spider-Man and he was included in Civil War, they cast Tom Holland, and I thought to myself, I really like this kid. He seems to portray both Peter Parker and Spider-Man well. And that was a knock on both Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield, is that the popular argument was Tobey Maguire was a good Peter Parker, but not a good Spider-Man. And on the flip side with Andrew Garfield, everyone loved his take on Spider-Man, but Peter Parker not so much. But Tom Holland played both pretty well. So he was a very welcome addition, at least to me he was. And after watching Civil War, I wanted to see more. And then we got Homecoming and Far From Home. And of course the cliffhanger at the end of Far From Home with Spider-Man's identity being revealed to the world thanks to J. Jonah Jameson and Mysterio. No Way Home picks up immediately after that movie concludes, and we see the fallout from the revelation that everyone knows who Spider-Man is. You see and I will preface this by saying that this is going to be very spoiler heavy. The movie's been out for weeks, and plus, you can't really talk about the high points of the movie without spoiling it. So you see the immediate fallout of news helicopters circling the apartment that May and Peter live in, and you see the immediate chaos that it's caused in his life. And then from there, everything else unfolds. He decides to go to Doctor Strange, asks, hey, can you maybe go back in time and make sure that this doesn't happen? Of course, Doctor Strange doesn't have the time stone anymore. But he decides to cast this spell to make everyone forget that Peter is Spider-Man. But as he's casting the spell, he's thinking, well, MJ should still know. Ned should still know. Aunt May should still know. That botches the spell, and then we get the opening of the multiverse. Now, leading up to the hype of this movie, I remember reading the story about Alfred Molina coming back as Doc Ock. And I was geeking out over it because Spider-Man 2, up until this movie came out, was my favorite Spider-Man movie. I thought he was the perfect Doc Ock. And even Kevin Feige said it. How do you recast that role? You can't, because he was perfect. So if you're going to bring back those villains, they have to be the same characters because they were played so well. So Alfred Molina says that he's going to be in No Way Home. Then from there, we slowly get the tease of other villains coming into this universe. We see the tease of Doc Ock, Green Goblin, Sandman, Electro. And how could you not be excited when you see that these characters are returning after all these years? And that's what drew me in, and I think that, and when Spider-Verse came out, got everybody's, gears turning in their head. Well, what if they did it in live action? What if they brought in Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield to come back? What if they brought in other villains to come back? And then we got it. We got the tease, and as soon as Doc Ock's announcement was made, everyone was thinking, okay, well, if they're bringing back the villains, they got to bring back the Spider-Man, right? They have to bring back Tobey Maguire and Andrew Garfield. And people were getting upset that they weren't being included in the promo material. I love that they weren't, because it wouldn't have ruined it, but it made for such a great experience. I'm going to get to the theater experience as well. It wouldn't have been the same, in my opinion, had we already known that they were going to be in it, which leads to the experience of watching it in the theater. I missed Avengers Endgame on opening night, and it's something that I regret, because I've watched YouTube videos of seeing, people freaking out over Captain America grabbing the hammer, of when everyone comes back and they come through the portals and they all line up. You see all the heroes against Thanos' army. Such a cool moment, and I hate that I missed it on opening night. And I told myself, and I told my fiance, I said, we've got to go see this opening night. I will regret it if I don't. And thankfully, she's as big a Marvel fan as I am. So we went opening night. All the anticipation, all the hype was there. And I can honestly say it was my favorite theater experience that I've ever had. From the moment when Charlie Cox's Daredevil shows up and you hear people clapping, I thought, okay, this is what I wanted. And that was another thing too, is that leading up to this movie, Kevin Feige says, well, if Daredevil does show up on screen, he will be played by Charlie Cox. And I thought the timing of that was interesting in the sense that, is he going to show up in Hawkeye? Is he going to show up in No Way Home? So he shows up as Peter's lawyer in No Way Home. And it was a little tease, like not a whole lot happened, but just seeing him play that role again. And he caught the brick, and everybody's like, well, how did you do that? And he says, well, I'm a really good lawyer. So I love that line. I love his take on Daredevil. He's so good in that role. I love the Netflix series. So was happy to see him back, and I can't wait to see what he does with the character moving forward now that it's officially part of the MCU. But little moments like when Doc Ock shows up for the first time and people are cheering, and the first time you actually see him, people are cheering. And then you hear the little clink, clink, clink of the Goblin Bomb, and as soon as it rolls on the screen, people start cheering. Because Willem Dafoe, he was already my favorite Spider-Man villain anyway, but after his performance in this role again, one was so much better than the original Spider-Man. But to me, it put him in that upper tier of comic book villains. Like, to me, he is up there with Heath Ledger's Joker as one of the best portrayals of a villain on screen. And the fight when he's fighting Tom Holland's Spider-Man in the hallway, and Peter's just, wailing haymakers on him, and he has the huge smile, and you hear that goblin cackle, was just awesome. Like, I geeked out over it, because to me, like, the laugh is perfect. His mannerisms, his voice when he goes from being Norman Osborn to Green Goblin, it is perfect. And I love that they broke his mask early and he went with the hood. and the glasses, or not glasses, goggles. When he went with the goggles, and it was just so well portrayed and so much better than the original Spider-Man. And other villains too. It was great seeing Thomas Hayden Church back as Sandman, Rhys Ifans, hopefully I'm saying his name correctly, back as Kirk Connors. The biggest redemption, though, was Jamie Foxx as Electro. He was one of the two show stealers of this movie, in my opinion. Personality-wise, very different to me than his original portrayal of Max Dillon in The Amazing Spider-Man 2. I love that they had him blue in the very beginning, but they worked a good workaround on why his appearance changed, because the energy in this universe was different than his. So he's pretty much playing Jamie Foxx, but he had some of the best one-liners in the entire movie. When he's standing there talking with Peter and Flint, and he says, "What, are you just going to pretend I'm not standing here butt-ass naked?" There's moments like that just made me laugh, and him having that redemption of getting to play that character again was great, and I'm so happy that it happened. But let's get to the moment that everyone was waiting for. Well, first, Aunt May dying, because that sets up what happens next. As soon as you see that shot of the glider lower into frame, I'm just thinking to myself, oh no, she's going to die. Which was amazing when she got back up, because I thought, well, maybe it didn't hit her that hard. And then she collapses. Peter holds up his hand and it's covered in blood, and we see the death of Aunt May. And not before that, she mentions the phrase that we've waited to hear in this incarnation of Spider-Man: with great power, there must also come great responsibility. Another geek out moment. Everyone cheered in the theater when that happened. And then, of course, Aunt May dies right after that. And Tom Holland's performance in this scene specifically, this was easily his best portrayal of Spider-Man on screen, but it was this moment when he's crying, and then we cut to him afterwards, and he's watching the giant screen in Times Square of J. Jonah Jameson saying, "Everything Spider-Man touches turns to ruin." He's standing in the rain, and you see that close-up of the camera just kind of panning over, and he just has this look of failure on his face. Like he doesn't care anymore at this point. It was just so gut-wrenching, and you felt his pain coming through the screen, which then leads into the next scene, which includes MJ and Ned. Ned has Doctor Strange's ring, so we learn in this that he has some type of magic control or control of magic. And he just says, "I wish we could find him." And you see that little spark as he waves his hand. So he does it again and again, and it opens, and we see clearly that it's Spider-Man, and they start yelling to him, and he turns around and stands up, and that's when you hear the audience go, because you see the eyes are bigger, his body type is different. We all know who he was, but he comes through the portal. Ned and MJ are freaking out. He rips his mask off, and it's Andrew Garfield, and the theater goes nuts. And I did too. My fiance Samantha did as well. I had no doubt that they were going to be in the movie, but still, when it happened, it couldn't prepare you for it. And it led to some of the most comedic moments of the entire movie. Like MJ doesn't believe that he's Spider-Man or Peter Parker, so he jumps up, sticks his hand to the ceiling, and he's just hanging there. And she's like, "Crawl across the room." And he's like, "I'm not going to crawl across the room." But he does it, and then Ned opens another portal and says, "Find Peter Parker." And then Tobey Maguire steps out of it in full, Peter Parker, as we learn, as Andrew Garfield calls him, youth pastor, which was one of the funniest moments of the entire movie. And the crowd goes even more nuts. And it's still surreal to think about it, to see those two, and in the next scene later with Tom Holland, seeing the three of them together was just so surreal. And the fact that they were there to console Peter, Tom Holland's Peter, or Peter 1, as we learn later on, they were there because they went through something similar. They know what he's feeling, and also to catch up with those two, because unlike the villains, because they were plucked from their universes right before they died, with the two Peters, they lived their lives. They were noticeably older. So we got to hear what they had gone through in the moments that we left them with their respective franchises, which I loved. And it makes me want to see a Spider-Man 4 with Tobey Maguire and an Amazing Spider-Man 3 with Andrew Garfield. Which, speaking on Andrew Garfield, he was the other show stealer in this movie. I loved his take on Spider-Man, but this took it over the top for me. And I'm sure that he felt very grateful to be a part of this, because as great as he was, his two movies were flawed in ways that the others weren't. So I was glad that he was able to get that almost redemption in a way. And it showed people why he was actually a great Spider-Man. And seeing the three of them converse as they're trying to cure the villains and come up with ways to cure them, coming up with their plan on the Statue of Liberty, and hearing them talk about, you know, their villains and their take on loss and what they've all gone through and how they all relate to each other. And that shot of the three of them on top of the Statue of Liberty, I want that framed, because I'm sure that shot is going to be released in high res at some point. I want that picture framed somewhere in the studio. It was just such a geek out moment for me, and it gave me flashbacks to one of my other favorite movie experiences of all time, and that was watching the original Spider-Man in 2002. My uncle picked me up from high school. I was a sophomore in high school at the time. And we drove straight to what was then the Rave Motion Pictures over on W Street here in Pensacola. And the theater was packed. This was before reserved seating, so it was every person for themselves. And there were 2 seats left in the upper corner of the room. Now, this theater was packed. Even the front row was pretty much full. And getting to see one of my favorite characters of all time on screen for the first time was something that has stood with me throughout the rest of my life. And not to discount what Endgame did, because it was an event much like this movie was. This topped Endgame for me in the sense that, yeah, Endgame was a 10-year build-up with all these different characters, but with No Way Home, you had 2 different studios and 3 generations of characters that came together and told a beautiful story. And that was one of my concerns going into this movie, is that with all the hype and all the nostalgia, would it still be a good movie? And it was. It had heart. It was fun. Are there little nitpicky things that you could talk about it? Sure. But none of those took away from the movie for me. This was my favorite MCU movie, my favorite Spider-Man movie, my favorite theater-going experience, and one of my just favorite movies of all time. Like, it's definitely in my top 10 movies of all time. It was one of the very few movies that I had high expectations for, and they were all exceeded. And I've watched the movie 4 times since then, and I had just as much fun watching it the 4th time as I did with the first. And that says a lot about modern day movies to me. Now, I did want to talk real quick before we move on. What does this mean for Peter Parker / Spider-Man going forward? Because the movie ends with all these other characters and villains trying to come into this universe, because when the spell was botched, it made everyone who remembers or knew Peter Parker was Spider-Man would bring them all to this universe. Now, Doctor Strange contained the spell, but a few of the characters got through, which we saw with Doc Ock, Green Goblin, and the 2 Peters. They were all starting to come through because the spell had been broken. And Peter has this idea, well, what if you cast another spell to make everyone forget that Peter Parker's Spider-Man? Now, that would come at a very big cost, but it was the only way to stop all these other characters from entering this universe. Essentially breaking the multiverse was the stakes that I got from this. So He says his goodbyes to MJ and Ned, and then he completes the spell, he being Doctor Strange. And we see the epilogue of Peter going into the coffee shop to remind MJ and Ned, hey, this is who I am. You don't remember me, but these are some of the experiences we've had. He sees that they're in a good place because all three of them had been denied entrance to MIT. Well, MJ and Ned get in post-spell. So Peter sees that they're in a good place without him, so he decides not to tell them. He gets this old rinky-dink apartment. We see that he has a GED book. We see that, he's got a police scanner. He makes a new suit, which is much more comic accurate. And it ends with him swinging through the city, much like the Tobey Maguire movies did. And in a way, I thought to myself, this was an origin trilogy for Tom Holland, because now he is Spider-Man. He is the one that makes those difficult choices because he sees the greater good. He looks at other people, he cares about them almost more than he does himself. He sacrifices more than other superheroes do. And I think that's what goes back to me talking about how he's so relatable, that he makes those difficult choices, and it just seems like he can never be happy. So it's very interesting to see where they're going to go with this character, and we're going to get a new trilogy with Tom Holland, and there's a couple of different directions they could go. And I'll get to the post-credit scene here in a second, because that's one of them. I think what would make logical sense, because J. Jonah Jameson is in this universe, and he's instrumental in the creation of Scorpion. So that could be a route they go. I don't know if that character is strong enough to be a singular villain that carries a movie, but I also didn't think that about Vulture. And we see that Michael Keaton did a great job portraying Adrian Toomes, and he's one of my favorite villains of the MCU. So if you cast a strong enough actor, you can make him enjoyable, and you can make him a good, compelling character. I would love to see Kraven the Hunter go up against Spider-Man. I know we're eventually going to get a Kraven movie with Aaron Taylor Johnson, so maybe they do that for the 5th movie. Or, as we saw in the mid-credit scene, the symbiote suit, or the symbiote, I should say, was left in the MCU after Tom Hardy and Venom were transported back to their universe. We see on the table in Mexico, there's a little piece of the symbiote that was left behind. So we could get a black-suited Spider-Man at some point. I hope it's not in the next movie, because we saw with Spider-Man 3, you don't need to rush that storyline. So there's a lot of different things they could do with Spider-Man. I'm really excited that now they're kind of going back to basics with the character. I love that they did something different in setting up this return to form, if you will. I just can't get over how good this movie was. And I've said this to multiple friends. I'm excited to see what else happens with the MCU. I'm really excited about Multiverse of Madness. I think it's going to be great, and they could do a lot of fun things with it. But it will never get better than this for me. As a lifelong Spider-Man fan, seeing Tobey Maguire, Andrew Garfield, and Tom Holland on screen together, seeing the classic villains back, it will never get better than that for me. But that's okay. I'm glad that someone like myself could have a moment like that in theaters, because I wish I could bottle up that feeling I had of watching this movie for the first time, because it was just so magical. And that's really all I can say about it. Is it a perfect movie? No, but to me, it kind of was. As a fan, it was. And it has moments that I will never forget. When this comes out on streaming, I'm going to watch it again. I honestly might go see it in theaters one more time before it ends its theatrical run, because that's how much I love this movie. So I can't say enough good things about No Way Home.